Hey everyone, a quick thing I wanted to mention before we get into the podcast. I'm going to start introducing the guests prior to the episode itself. So this is a separate recording. I'm actually recording this after I recorded the episode. And I'm just going to start doing that because it's going to make things significantly easier for everybody involved. Instead of me introducing them briefly and then putting them on the spot by asking them to talk more about themselves, I'm just going to have them send a text block and then I'm going to read that off in the beginning, and it's just going to be a lot smoother. Now, I did introduce the guest a little bit in the beginning of the episode, but I'm going to do it a little more in depth here. So the guest today is Alex Prieditis. Alex is a 25-year-old professional wildlife photographer and photography educator based out of Toronto, Ontario, Canada. He teaches both in the field and offers online services aimed at helping all kinds of photographers improve. In his wildlife photography, his special interest is in shorebirds and capturing them in different kinds of environments and conditions. Through his work, he has accumulated an extensive and diverse knowledge on camera equipment. And that's kind of the reason why I wanted to get him on. I mean, he's really knowledgeable about pretty much everything, but about gear specifically, I mean, he's really well versed in this stuff. And I've had a gear episode on my radar, basically when I thought of having the idea of starting this podcast, but I wanted to hold it off for a couple episodes because, it's not everyone's favorite thing and it's not very wildlife oriented, but I decided it was time to put one out, and he was the first guy I went to. But this was a really fun episode. It's actually my longest episode to date. I'm sure you can see that now on whatever platform you're looking at it. But yeah, it was a blast, and I hope you guys have a lot of fun watching it. So I'll see you there. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Art in the Wild. I hope you guys are doing good. Now, today's episode, we're going to be talking about gear, which I think is a pretty good topic for wildlife photography in general. I do, down the line, want to do more gear episodes. However, today's episode is just going to be kind of a general overview. We're going to be talking about lenses. We're going to be talking about cameras and megapixels and just kind of a whole bunch of stuff. And I'm going to be talking with Alex Prieditis, who is a full-time wildlife photographer from Ontario, Canada. And Alex, what was the first encounter with a wild animal that kind of got you into wildlife photography, but also wildlife in general?
Yeah, so the very first encounter that I guess would put me into that wildlife photography mindset, because
Mhm.
obviously when you're younger, you'll run into animals and it might trigger something, but not like this drive.
Yeah.
So the very first thing that really triggered that drive was there's two animals actually. So on Carleton campus, Carleton University,
Mhm.
there it was a snowy owl living there and also a barred owl.
Mhm.
And I saw them almost every day. And at that time, I was studying biology, and I was like, "Wow, these owls that live here, really? That's wild."
Yeah.
So I kept coming back and I kept looking at them. I was like, you know what? It'd be pretty cool to photograph them. Unfortunately, what happened is this was as spring was rolling around, and by the time I actually got a camera, they both disappeared, which is very awkward. That happens,
Mhm.
but the drive still kept carrying me. So I went out and started birding, exploring the area a bit more, and I eventually um, started working with other kinds of subjects, looking at watching them and stuff like that.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, but those owls really stayed in the back of my mind. And at this time, I was doing an ornithology class, so I was always around different kinds of birds.
Mhm.
So I got to learn a lot of the different kinds of birds that you wouldn't normally think of, right? So a lot of warblers, vireos, other kinds of songbirds. And I thought, you know what? Let's let's just explore this a bit more. And I eventually got a camera and haven't stopped since.
That's awesome. Yeah, dude, having barred owls and snowy owls on your campus is not fair at all. And in Montana, we had great horned owls, and I would see the pellets, and then my teachers would be like, "Oh, 2 years ago, they nested right over in that tree," and they would sit on the windowsill. And I got really excited for nesting season, and I could never find them. But owl's a pretty good spark bird. So basically, you just kind of went, you saw the owls, got obsessed with that, got into all the other wildlife, and then just kind of carried it on, just doing it like most people. How did you transfer it? Because you are a full-time wildlife photographer,
Mhm.
correct?
Yes.
So how did you transfer from doing it as a hobby, like most people do, into being like, okay, I'm gonna make this like a full-time kind of deal?
Okay. It's pretty funny.
Mhm.
Um, Basically, what happened is I was in university and I was poor as hell.
Yeah.
And I was like, you know what? I'm liking photography. I'm getting decent at it. Why don't I just go off and try to make money doing this?
Mhm.
So the first thing I did is I tried to do shoots. I was completely out of my depth, horrible at them.
Yeah.
Um, and then I'm like, you know what? I need some more practice. So I started practicing a bit more with portrait and commercial type photography.
Mhm.
And then I eventually started getting some work that way. But then what happened is I found a listing for a teaching job and I applied for that and I got the job, beating out a bunch of people who went to school for photography, which is pretty cool. From there, that's kind of where I built my business.
Mhm.
So I'm doing a lot of teaching, um, a lot of consultations, stuff like that. And still have a lot of clients that I started with that I have now. So that was really it was like a slow transition, right? Because you're starting from being a student, you're teaching a few classes each time, then you're building up more clientele.
Yeah.
Um, I'm in a little bit of an awkward transition right now because I left school a little
Mhm.
while ago, and those clients were in Ottawa,
Mhm.
and now I'm in Toronto. So trying to build up that same client base here is a little bit challenging, but it's getting there's more people in Toronto, so it's not that bad.
Really? Yeah, that's
Yeah.
awesome. So do you do any like in-person workshops through that education, or is it more kind of like classroom style teaching?
So I would say that 90% of the classes are
Mhm.
in person workshop style.
Oh, really? Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So very, very little are classroom stuff. Maybe for if you're doing computer stuff, there'll be more classroom.
Yeah.
But for actual, it's definitely hands on.
Mhm. Yeah, I got you. I do a lot of speaking for like I've done some stuff through some companies virtually and whatnot, and then I've done some in-person talks, but all of my stuff has kind of been classroom public speaking with like 30, 40, 50 people or more. Not
Okay.
always on photography. So sometimes I do like I have a talk that's pretty popular on just owls. So I just talk about owls for an hour. It's pretty sweet. But I'm pretty good at like the larger public speaking format, but I haven't really done a smaller workshop style thing. So it is something I'm going to be looking at doing at some point. Are print sales playing into it as well? Are you selling prints a lot, or is that just kind of like a more of a minor side thing?
So at the beginning, it was definitely a more important part of the business.
Mhm.
Nowadays, I've kind of slacked off a little bit on
Yeah.
in that in that area. So less of a factor. But because I want to eventually move out east to Nova Scotia or PEI,
Mhm.
I need to try to gain a bit of that back because it will help the transition while regaining more clients.
Make it easier. Yeah.
Yep.
Have you done craft fairs by any chance?
No, so most of my prints were just people that knew of me
Yeah.
and they would reach out to me and ask for things. We would do kind of like a little consultation,
Mhm.
get what they wanted, and then I charge them, a few $100 for whatever print they want.
Yeah. I need to do better at marketing my own stuff online because I'm pretty bad at it. But what I'll do is, especially during the holiday season, if you go to a craft fair and set up, it's like a blast because people will come and talk to you and they'll ask you about all the animal encounters, which is really cool. Although sometimes, sometimes you get some interesting questions. I had this one lady, so I had an image of a grizzly bear with two cubs. This
Mm-hmm.
lady walks up to me with her friend and she points, I shit you not, this actually happened. She points at it and looks at me and goes, "Is that a rhinoceros?" And I'm looking at her and I'm like, no, it's a bear with two cubs, you know?
Um, wow.
Yeah.
I will avoid insulting this person right now, but that is that's hilarious. Well, like I went to occasionally I will visit these things, and
Yeah.
I'll look at the other photographers, and it's interesting because there are some very good photographers that will go off and market this way, because I know there's a bit of a stigma around it amongst
Yeah.
like the professional photography community. It's like, oh, the craft fairs, they're for trashy photographers, but I'm consistently surprised. Like, yeah, there are like a few, of the kind of like, less skilled photographers. But
But
then there also will be people there who it's like their business just to sell these different things. They're hopping around all the time,
mhm.
selling these fantastic prints for pretty significant amounts of money. So
Yeah,
it's interesting.
there's a pair of full-time wildlife photographers. They retired, I think. So now I guess they just do photography without making money. I'm not exactly sure how that works, but I think like their entire business was just going to craft fairs and selling there. And I usually advise that to people, especially younger people, because I did my first one when I was like 13 or 14, and my images weren't that great. But when you have like a little kid with like a huge camera talking about owls and stuff, it's a pretty effective sales technique. Now, with your consultations and stuff like that and talking to your clients, this is a gear episode. Do you do like gear consultations and help them pick out what gear they should purchase or how to use their gear?
Yeah. So I have a specific service called the gear consultation.
Yeah.
And for that, that's all about helping people find the gear that they need to get.
Mhm.
And it's interesting because, gear is such a challenging topic because there's just so much out there.
Yeah.
And there's things that people don't think about when they're actually purchasing gear.
Mhm.
So in general, with those gear consultations, the people come in with an idea of what they think they want, and then they'll come out with, what they need.
Yeah.
It's interesting. You'll get into these conversations with people and talk about how they shoot, and then they'll talk about what they think they need, and you're like, well, that's not really you know conducive to how you actually shoot,
Mhm.
right? It's like I mean, like some people look at the gear that I use and like, oh, that must be what what I should get. It's
Yeah.
like, well, no, it's like my gear is very specific to how I shoot. It's not like an everyman's tool,
Mhm.
right? So like it it's a very interesting dynamic that you can get into discussing the equipment like that.
Yeah. What are like a few questions you would ask to kind of feel out what kind of gear someone needs? Is it like what environments they shoot in or lighting conditions they like?
Okay, so the first thing I'll do is I'll look at their images,
Mhm.
and then I will kind of get a stylistic idea of how they're shooting.
Yeah.
Then I'll ask them what kind of photographers they look up to and want to kind of copy, I guess.
Yeah.
Then I will just clarify what they're currently shooting with. Generally, I'll have their images on like a larger screen that I've
Yeah.
looked at before, so I know what kind of image quality we're talking about. I'll ask their budget,
Mhm.
and then I will go into talking exactly about how they shoot in the field. So I'll ask them, it's like when you go out to photograph a bird, are you spending a lot of time waiting, or are you kind of just more of a run and gun shooter? What kind of environments do you shooting? What kind of environments do you want to shoot in?
Mhm.
Are you planning any trips for anything? What kind of mobility situation do you have? I had sometimes I'll have people with wheelchairs, and that's a
Yeah.
very different recommendation than like a young kid with like $50,000 budget, right?
Yeah. 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 Exactly.
um, so like I'll ask them all about that. Then we'll kind of dive into options that are commonly talked about.
Mhm.
So like we'll talk like the more standard options like Canon 100 to 500, Sony 200 to 600, Sigma
Yeah.
150 600, stuff like that. And I'll talk about the pros and cons of those, and then I'll judge their opinion because sometimes it depends. You get a mix, right? You get a
Mhm.
mix of people who are beginners and then people who are quite advanced, and sometimes you'll get even professionals.
Yeah.
So every person's a little bit different, and some people are coming into wildlife photography. Some people have been shooting wildlife photography for a very long time.
Mhm.
So it's really important to ask all these different questions.
Yeah, I got you. Do you find yourself, because I mean everyone has a lot of different styles, but I find that a lot of, there's kind of like a middle range of people that are just kind of like going out and taking that aren't putting a ton of like thought into the like their style and the quality of the images, and they're just kind of going out to shoot and have fun. Do you find yourself kind of advising the same setups, generally speaking, or are there a couple setups you find yourself advising repetitively, or is it just way too varied that you can't even pin that down?
You know what? In general, most of the gear consultations are for people who are moving out of that stage.
Okay, yeah.
So I don't have to, like when I'm recommending to absolute beginners, usually I'm not going to give them a gear consultation because I'm just like, you don't need it.
Mhm.
You're at that stage where you know any kind of more basic kit will do fine. You don't have to have any specialized gear.
Yeah.
So for them, I'll usually at this point in time recommend a Canon R10 and the RF 100 to
100 to
400.
400. Yep. called
Yep.
it. Yep. Yeah.
Right. And it's like that's going to give you, everything you need and
Mhm.
nothing that you don't need. So that's like that's kind of like the default mindset. And if some
Yeah.
people are like sometimes look at people are like, oh, it's too affordable. It's like, okay, fine, you can buy the 100 to 500 then, and the R
Yeah.
and the
Yeah.
R5 if you really want to. They're
Yeah.
going to do the same thing basically.
Mhm.
Um, that's always funny when you have someone saying, no, it's too cheap. I need something better. Like I was like, well, it's not going to get you better results really, but there is this option that's a lot
Yeah.
more expensive
If you just
that
want to
you can
spend
go
more
to.
money for no
Yeah,
reason,
yeah,
just to do
exactly.
it.
Yeah.
So looking at lenses and stuff like you mentioned, the 100 to 500 and 200 600, something I've talked to you a lot about in the past, but I still haven't really necessarily wrapped my head around is rendering and how your
Okay.
images are rendered specifically by like a lens. So can you talk about like what rendering is and then how lenses specifically affect that?
Okay. So rendering is a sort of abstract concept to a lot of people.
Mhm.
It can be challenging to wrap your head around for sure. Essentially, rendering is how the image looks, but specifically when we talk about rendering in our conversations, we're
Yeah.
talking about the tonal qualities of the image. So we're looking at like how many tones are
Mhm.
captured in from the lens or the
Mhm.
camera, and that's like something that the lens is physically doing. So
Yeah.
it's just how the light plays off of it. So things like your contrast, your micro contrast. So that'd be like the fine detail contrast.
Mhm.
Um, how many midtones we have. That's all rendering. And then the other aspect of rendering is going to be your background blur and background your depth of field.
Yeah.
So certain lenses have a smoother bokeh even at the same aperture.
Mhm.
Other lenses have a more harsh edged bokeh, sometimes with inner rings on it.
Yeah.
So like altogether, that creates the look of the lens.
Mhm.
It's very hard to explain. I know, like I showed you when you see it, like see a side by side comparison, it's a lot easier to understand.
Yeah.
But yeah, like for example, I showed you the 100 to 500 and then the 200 to 400 f4 with a
Mhm.
teleconverter,
Mhm.
and you'll see that in the 100 to 500, it's very very sharp, but it's lacking some of those complexities in the way the midtones are falling off. So it looks a little bit less three dimensional.
Yeah.
Whereas the 200 to 400 had this more three dimensional look, and there's also in terms of color, the 200 to 400 is a little bit of colder lens,
Mhm.
and then the 100 to 500 a little bit warmer, and they're very similar in terms of actual sharpness, right? But it's just the look from those two lenses is fairly different.
Mhm.
And if you were to take like say a much cheaper lens, like a Sigma 150 to 600 contemporary,
I'm very familiar with that one.
you'll
Yeah.
notice that the images are even like less dimensional, right? It's just flatter,
Yeah.
right? And sometimes like if you put like a teleconverter behind a lens, it will soften up the image, but it'll also reduce the contrast, creating this flatter look. So it does play into that contrast aspect as well.
Mhm.
Hopefully, I explain that. It's a very challenging topic to explain because it's just like so like kind of like a big brained idea.
Yeah, yeah, I got you. Well, it made a lot of sense when you described it. Now, you're looking at like contrast and stuff. How much of this can be fixed in post? Is like, can a lot of it be fixed in post? Because like, let's say you pick up a lens and you're really excited about it, but then someone tells you about rendering and they're like, "Oh, your lens has terrible rendering," and then you're like, "Crap! Like, are you just screwed?" Or can you
it
fix
you
a
know
lot
what
of it in poster?
it depends.
Oh boy.
Some lenses
Mhm.
are like, okay, so the rendering is it's basically capturing different tones, right? So
Yeah.
it's like a captured amount of information. With some lenses, if they're just low contrast, and you can increase the contrast slider and you'll
Mhm.
fix the problem, right?
Yeah.
That's with a lot of teleconverters when you add it, that's how you can fix the rendering on them.
Mhm.
Some lenses are just inherently worse with the amount of contrast and tones and stuff.
Yeah.
um for like a really really cheap lens, you're kind of like you're never going to achieve that really nice look that a really high end pro lens would. But
Yeah.
then like there are some pro lenses, like say 100 to 500 versus the um 200 to 400, where
Mhm.
it is just a naturally flatter look, and it's very very hard to give it that extra pop,
Yeah.
but you can get kind of close.
Mhm.
So like using clarity, texture, saturation, using your curves, you can get it pretty close where it's not that big of a deal. right? Like I've talked about like the 500 PF having like lesser rendering than some other lenses,
Yeah.
but if you actually work the files on it, you
Mhm.
can you can get it to look pretty good. It's not like a problem for that lens.
Yeah.
It's more of an issue if the lens is like really poorly rendered and it's also soft. If it's really soft,
Yeah.
then you're screwed. You're completely
Yeah.
screwed.
Okay. Well, it's good to know that I'm not permanently screwed with the 500 PF for right now. Are you able to like look at an image? Like if I were to give you two raw files, are you familiar with some lenses enough to be able to look at it and tell what lens that was from by looking at it or no?
It depends.
Sometimes, yeah.
Sometimes I can, sometimes I can't because the composition has a huge effect on the end result of the image.
Yeah.
So if someone composes it with the background farther away than another one, I will struggle to tell the difference there. Like in terms of
Yeah.
the tones too, like that's depends on the lighting. So like
Mhm.
if I know they're in the exact same lighting, then yeah, sometimes I can, especially with the Canon stuff.
Mhm.
I'm more familiar with that.
Yeah.
Other times it's just like it's a crapshoot because sometimes the rendering of the lens is not like that big of a factor to the end result.
Mhm. I got you. That'd be wild if like someone was showing you an image, you're like, "Oh, did you take that on the Sony A1 with the 200/600 and just like completely predict it correctly just off the image they showed you?"
You know what? I might be able to predict that one in
Yeah.
particular. It's got a distinctive look, but um, more likely you'll predict what lens they shot because you'll see how they edited the photo. There's a
Fair.
certain kind of edit people tend to do when they have that set up.
Yeah, yeah, I got you. With rendering, how does the camera play into it? Because you have the lens, but then you mentioned that the camera does as well. I'd imagine maybe the camera would play into colors some. I'm not entirely sure though.
Yeah, so the camera. So okay, so when you have higher noise in an image,
Mhm.
the rendering is going to get a little flatter, just because
Yeah.
there's less contrast.
Mhm.
So cameras that are cleaner will tend to do better. So if you look at like the full screen results of say like a Canon R3, which is 24 megapixel full
Yeah.
frame sensor, and then
Mhm.
compare that to a Canon R7, which is a 32 megapixel APS-C sensor,
Yeah.
you'll see that the R3 is just so much more dimensional, so much like cleaner and crisper, even though there's technically more megapixels in that R7.
Mhm.
It's just because of the sensor size and the way the contrast plays off of that.
I got you.
Um, you'll also see a little bit difference in color too. So those cleaner files tend to the cleaner cameras will tend to have a little bit better color.
Mhm.
So just overall, they tend to have better overall rendering until you crop them to death.
Yeah, yeah, I got you. So with lenses, I feel like a lot of people often debate like prime versus zooms and things like that. Um, what are the primary advantages and disadvantages to both kinds of lens? Because for anyone who doesn't know, a prime is like a lens that's consistent focal length, so it stays at like 400 or whatever, and then zoom is like it can go from like 150 to 600 or 70 to 200 or something like that. So what are some general advantages and disadvantages to each kind?
Okay, so I'll start with primes. Primes, okay, there's a few major advantages. So
Yeah.
if you get like the top of the line primes, you have a light gathering advantage. So they generally have a faster aperture, so a lower f stop number.
Mhm.
So like a 400 2.8, 600 f4, 800 5.6,
Yeah.
200 f2, stuff like that.
Mhm.
Um, they also tend to have a little bit better rendering, on average, not always.
Yeah.
And you'll be able to put teleconverters on them better, on average, not always. Again,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, they also it's just that combination of that aperture with their focal length, it just gives them a really impressive look a lot of times. So there's a
Mhm.
certain kind of pop to them that you
Yeah.
don't get with a lot of the zooms. Um, but of course, that pop it sort of disappears when you go into like the lighter weight, smaller primes, like the 5.6s and maybe the f4.5s, where
Mhm.
they don't have that same depth of field. So that
Yeah.
advantage is lost.
Mhm.
Another advantage of primes is that for a given aperture, so like say you have a 500 PF and then you have a 200 to 500, 500
Yeah.
PF is going to be lighter. So they tend to be quite a bit lighter given those same specs on the long end.
Mhm.
Um, I also think primes will tend to give you a certain style of shooting. It is not really like a pro or a con. It's just that when you have a prime and you can't zoom, you are more likely to be moving around more. and trying to
Yeah.
compose with how your movements,
Hmm.
which for wildlife photography, I mean, that can be like a good skill to have, but also you could screw yourself because you might scare off the animals.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
With zooms, you can zoom back and forth to change your focal length. That's their biggest advantage.
Hmm.
So you could shoot at 600 millimeters, then zoom back to like 150, get two different compositions, and you have everything in between as well,
Yeah.
which is like fantastic. The other thing with zooms is, on average, they tend to be a little bit cheaper,
Hmm.
um, or in some cases, a lot cheaper, just because
Yeah.
they're more, and you can get more consumer oriented options as well. The thing with the zooms that's also pretty nice is they're just so convenient when you're out because you have that zoom range. You can just kind of screw off a little bit with like your compositions. You play around more and
Yeah.
more a lot more flexibility that you're just not going to get with the prime. Like I know, like when I'm shooting my 800 millimeter prime, like I'm like the bird comes in close,
You're screwed. You just can't do anything.
you're completely screwed.
Yeah.
There's nothing you can do. You're just gonna sit there watching that bird walk up to you, and
Hmm.
done. Or also, if I'm shooting more by wide angle lens, like say like a 28 millimeter, if the bird's slightly too far, I can't take a shot at all. Like there's nothing you can do about it, and you only
Yeah.
have this very narrow amount of range where it's actually optimal. And it's a bigger effect on the shorter lenses. So the shorter the lens is,
Hmm.
the worse it's going to be with your basic coverage, right? So like a 28 millimeter lens, I have like half a second where I can actually take photos, and then the bird's out of range.
Really?
Yeah. So,
Man.
well, yeah, because the working distance on the 28 is like a foot,
Yeah.
is a foot or less, basically.
Jeez.
So it's like even those like small in frame shots, those are maybe like 2 feet away.
Yeah.
So it's like it's whereas like with if you have an 800 millimeter, I can cover basically the entire beach and take photos,
Hmm.
except for this like little 6 meter circle around me.
Yeah. Yeah. I've man, so I just switched to a prime like 5 months ago. I got the 500 PF. I went from the Sigma 150 to 600, and I miss being able to zoom. Like I've been shooting a lot of piping plovers recently and the chicks and stuff. And I mean, if it runs up to me, I can't zoom out and include more beach. I'm just like, oh well, this is a cool bird. I'm gonna stare at it now for 30 seconds when it's right in front of me. And as you said, you just can't do anything about it. Are I've heard of people talk about like prime sharpness. Are primes on average like significantly sharper than zooms, or with newer zooms, is that gap starting to kind of close?
You know what? On average, they're probably slightly sharper,
Yeah.
but there are a lot of exceptions.
Mhm.
Like my 200 to 400 f4 lens is sharper than my 400 2.8 was,
Yeah.
and that's sharper than most of the primes I tested. Sharper than 800, sharper than 600, sharper. So
Yeah.
that lens in particular is sharper. But if you took like the average like 600 f4 and compared it to a 200 to 600, 600 f4 is going to be better. But like
Yeah.
but the thing is though, I'd say the rendering difference is bigger than the actual sharpness difference. I wouldn't
Mhm.
like. I'm not going to be. I honestly, I don't buy a prime for the sharpness
Yeah.
anymore. It's for the aperture and the rendering.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I would love to get lower apertures. With as the technology continues to increase, do you think that, because I mean technology for specifically for cameras over the last like 5 years, but with lenses, as well has started to really significantly increase. Do you think that primes could become obsolete, say 10, 20, 30 years in the future, as that technology increases? Like could we see a tack sharp 14 to 600 f 2.8 or something ridiculous? I know it's probably not possible, but you get what I'm saying. Could that gap close so much that primes just it doesn't really make any sense to have them? Or
yeah. So we're starting to see that gap already, like starting to close.
yeah.
In fact, like especially on the high end for telephotos, like you have lenses that are coming out like the Canon 100 to 300 f 2.8. You have lenses
Mhm.
like a 200 to 400 f4, 180 to 400 f4 with built-in DCs.
Yeah.
You have the Nikon 120 to 300 2.8. You also have the Canon 28 to 70 f2.
Hmm.
Um, like these lenses, in many cases, like the Canon 100 to 300, that outperforms pretty much all the primes in Canon's lineup
Yeah.
already. So like that lens, outside of cost, is vastly superior to the primes. And so we're definitely starting to see that now. And with Canon, they're coming out with a 200 or up allegedly coming with a 200 to 500 f4 to replace both the 200 to 400 f4 and the 500 f4.
Wow.
Right. and
Yeah.
that'd be incredible, right?
Yeah,
That's
that'd be wild.
like the ultimate range. You get like any shot that you want, good aperture, and there's no advantage to a prime over that because they're not faster. And I bet you this is going to be a little lighter too than the previous prime.
Wow, that's wild. Yeah, it's just what do you think the timeline is going to be on that? Like over the course, let's say 5 years from now. I mean, I know it's hard to predict, but do you think it's going to be like in the over the next 3 years that we really start to see primes kind of fall down, or five, or maybe like a decade or something? And honestly, as far as the technology has increased, I don't even know if we'll be using actual cameras in 10 years. You know what I'm saying? Because
Yeah, it's interesting how quickly the technology is moving. I
mm,
think that with primes, I don't know, like you might see them start to push the envelope of primes a bit more
yeah,
to kind of get that gap. Like we don't see that many autofocus, or I don't think we see any autofocus 0.95 lenses, right?
mhm.
But they could definitely do like a 50 0.95
Yeah,
or 85 0.95, right?
that'd be
With
wild.
more modern technologies, and that would help extend that gap. So
Mhm.
I don't know if they try pushing that route, I think the gap will just continue forever because there is like a technological advantage if you can do that.
Yeah,
But if you're going for more like the more traditional lenses, like a 50 millimeter 1.4, I mean, I would take a 28 to 70 f2 right now over that lens,
yeah.
right? So I think we're already starting to see this this transition. So I don't know. I can't predict the future, but I can see a lot
What
of
you mean? You
primes.
can't predict the future? Come on.
I can see a lot of primes becoming obsolete, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, but there is like a catch with that, and that's a lot of it. Primes are cheaper to make for the same aperture, right?
Mhm.
So maybe we'll see is just a lot of cheaper primes with the same apertures, and then the more expensive zoom counterparts.
So just like flip flops, basically. So now the primes are the cheaper versions and the zooms are more
Yeah,
expensive.
yeah, because I have a feeling that like that Canon 200 to 500 f4 is going to be like a $20,000 lens.
20,000. I mean, I
Yeah,
wouldn't blame them, but still, that's like crazy.
well, yeah, it's hefty, right? But like the 100 to 300 f2.8 was twice as expensive as the 300 2.8 was,
Mhm.
right? At full launch prices, and it's like four times more expensive than the used prices. It's
Wow.
why it's the difference is massive.
Yeah, I mean, the versatility is just a massive advantage.
Oh
Like,
yeah,
I can't. I feel like I've become a worse photographer since I've switched over from Zoom. Even though my old lens was just, I mean, the Sigma can't really, it just was way worse. It because I can't, I don't have that versatility. I can't zoom out. I can't be like, oh, this turn is sitting in a really cool spot with this composition. I'm gonna zoom out and get all of that. I'm just stuck at 500. If it comes too close, I'm screwed. But also, all the images just kind of look the same. Do you get what I'm saying?
yeah, I know exactly what you're saying, and I mean, I have a solution for that. It's like not a solution you want to do probably,
Just
but
buy
just to
more
buy
lenses.
more lenses. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's what I
Yeah.
do. Like I'll go out there. I have like I think I normally am like four lenses ever with me,
Wow.
like and like I'll use all of them if I can,
Mhm.
but like I'm sitting there, it's like this is a really expensive solution to a problem that could have been saved with a cheaper lens. And something
Yeah.
that goes through my mind, especially if I'm gonna bring a 1.4 lens, I'm gonna stop it down. It's
Mhm.
like I'm like I'll shoot like a 40 millimeter 1.4, stop it down to f11. It's like what the hell am I doing? I just
Yeah.
spent like 3 grand on this lens, and now I'm just like using it as a kit lens.
Mhm. Yeah. So roughly how many lenses have you shot with over the course of your whole wildlife photography career? I know I'm kind of putting you on
Oh
the
my
spot
god.
with that. I'm not expecting an exact number, but
For wildlife or just in general?
hmm, just in general, honestly, we could just say just in general.
I don't know, like 40,
40,
like a 40 or
man.
something.
You want to know how many I've shot with?
How many?
Two.
Two.
Two. Well, I had some older ones when I was a kid. I had that. I talked on that my last, not my last episode, second to last episode with Jack. I had that Tamron 100 to 300 or whatever it
Oh yeah,
was.
yeah.
And that thing I dropped off the couch when I was sleeping with my foot on accident. I kicked it off and broke. That's not the point. So I did shoot with that, and then I shot one time with a 40 macro, and I was able to get some rough grouse stuff. But aside from
Yeah,
that, the only lenses I really shot with, like actually seriously shot with, were the Sigma 150 to 600 and the 500 PF. I mean, in the past when I was younger, I shot with the 150 to 500 for like a year. This old Sigma one. I don't know
Yeah,
if
yeah,
that. I mean, but it's kind of like the same thing as 150 to
yep.
600. So my gear experience is very limited, but I might just have to go out and buy more lenses.
Wait,
So
it's funny. I because I shoot portrait photography as well.
yeah.
I have so many lenses that I use for wildlife that don't make any sense in terms of your think of like a cost benefit analysis.
Hmm.
Just like 28 millimeter 1.4,
Hmm.
like that lens is like one of the it's okay, it's an amazing lens, but that
Yeah.
would be like absolutely stupid to purchase if you're just a wildlife photographer. Like just
Yeah.
one of the dumbest purchases you can make, right?
Hmm.
Or I have a 14 millimeter 1.8. It's like
Yeah.
you're never gonna use that unless you're like very, very, very specific situations.
Hmm.
So that's allowed me to explore the gear a bit more just because I have it. Um, and I have to, I'm also trying to optimize both of my kind of genres.
Yeah.
So it kind of it allows for a bit more freedom with gear and the money you throw into it.
Yeah, I got you. I've heard with people like talking about buying lenses, they'll usually say buy used glass instead of new glass. Would you agree with that sentiment, or is that something you would disagree with?
In general, I agree with it.
Hmm.
You'll save a lot of money doing that way, and I recommend that for most of my clients.
Yeah.
However, if there's something very specific that you just can't find used, you're up the creek and got to buy it new.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like if you're a sports photographer and you also do wildlife and you really, really, really need a 100 to 300 2.8, like you just
Hmm.
need that lens,
Yeah.
you got to buy it new. You got to buy new, or you got to find a way to deal with having multiple lenses that you're just having around.
Yeah. Yeah, I got you. Also with cameras, I know a lot of people in the past used to say buy used, I mean, new cameras because the shutter count and you don't want to have to, but with electronic shutter and like mirrorless cameras, does that still apply now?
Okay, so I have a little story to tell you
Oh, okay,
about
bet.
so my friend, he dropped his Nikon Z9 in
Hmm.
the water and completely soaked the whole thing. Didn't work. Sent it to
Wow.
Nikon. They dried it out. They said you're screwed. It's going to start rusting inside. It will work temporarily, but over time, you're going to be effed.
Hmm.
So me, being the logical, um, money oriented person I am,
Yeah.
said, "Well, Mike, what you do is just sell it on Kijiji. Don't tell
Yeah.
anyone, and say and just, but you're not going to lie. What you're going to say is, it's like I this camera is in perfect physical external condition. Don't mention the internals. Just but you're not lying. You're just being deceitful. It's different.
Yeah, just
And
so
a few of the other people in my group were like, yeah, do the same thing. And there's definitely a lot of that. So if you're willing to take the chance that you're just going to be screwed, if you have insurance, like you can, it's less of an issue, right? You could
yeah, yeah.
just if you just my camera died, oh no, I have to have a claim. But if you don't have insurance, you may want to buy new, especially if it's a newer camera. It's just not
Yeah.
worth the risk. It's always a little suspicious, especially if you like see
Yeah.
like a Nikon Z9
With
for like
perfect external condition, yeah.
perfect external condition,
Yeah.
works great, $3,000. You're like, that's a little
Suspicious.
fishy.
Yeah, some poor bastard just buys a Z9, they're all excited, and then 2 months later it just breaks and stops working on them.
Yep, yep. And then send it into Nikon. Say, yep, you're rusted inside. Can't do anything about it. Go f yourself. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah, I'm gonna write that down on my notepad. Don't buy used cameras. Um, Now, looking at cameras, also, the next question I want to ask is relating to megapixels because a lot of people really focus on that. I focus on it a little bit because I mean I do like having, and that's one thing I am happy about with the Z9 when I got it is the 45 megapixels. I like being able to crop in the amount that I can. I get like blown away how much I can zoom in on my images because I went from like a 20 megapixel, it was a crop sensor, so what's closer, but like I couldn't, I could only zoom in so much. And then when I
Yep.
got the new camera, like I can just, it's like Google Earth. I can just keep zooming in on the feathers and the fur and whatever. But I feel like a lot of the time, especially for some people that may not necessarily shoot in a style that requires it, megapixels might be a little overrated, if that makes sense. You know what I'm saying? How do you
Yep.
feel about that?
Yeah. So megapixels have become such a important topic
Hmm.
for the wildlife photography community,
Yeah.
and it's because of how people tend to shoot.
Hmm.
When most people, they just on average, they'll tend to take a photo. They won't try to focus on getting close, and then they'll crop it in. Like
Hmm.
that's just how it is. And for those kind of people, extra megapixels do help them get more detail. But a lot of people who are a little maybe a little more skilled in their approach will not be cropping that much, and then
Yeah.
the extra rendering qualities and low light performance of the lower megapixel cameras will
Hmm.
tend to do a little bit better. You see this debate also between full frame cameras and crop sensor cameras, right? Especially like a high megapixel crop sensor camera, like a Canon R7, who has 32
Yeah.
megapixels. If a camera like that, that's like giving you the extra reach equivalent of like a teleconverter on an R5, which is already
Hmm.
45 megapixels.
Yeah.
So, but the trade off starts becoming fairly steep when you're dealing with like the R7 versus R5, and
Hmm.
then between like an R5 and an R3, 24 megapixel, 45 megapixel, the trade off for cropping is not as steep in a lot of cases. So for a lot of people, it does make more sense to go for the higher megapixel camera because it gives you that flexibility.
Yeah.
And if you're going to be shooting at those lower ISOs, like 100 to, you know, honestly, on those full frame cameras, even 3200,
Hmm.
if you're staying in that range a lot, and you're not really going over that too much, those high megapixel cameras, they they will help you if the performance specs line up, right?
Yeah.
The lower megapixel cameras they'll tend to have certain specs that are a little bit like higher performance. So they'll have bigger buffers.
Hmm.
They'll often shoot faster. So like a Canon R5 does 20 frames per second. An R3 can do 30 or the equivalent of 195 full raw.
Yeah.
And then the R6 Mark II can do 40.
Yeah.
So like obviously if you need that extra speed, those lower megapixel cameras tend to do a little bit better. They also tend to edit a little easier. Whereas the high megapixel cameras, um, most modern computers they can handle it, but I don't know. From my own experience, I have to edit on client computers sometimes
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I'll take photos for them and then I'll edit on there. And there was definitely an issue with
Hmm.
having those higher megapixel cameras, but that's like kind of like out of the scope of wildlife. That's like a professional concern.
Yeah. Yeah. I got you. Yeah.
Um, so like they're overrated for people who can actually get the compositions that they want in the field.
Hmm.
But then there are just a lot of people that can't do that yet. And
Yeah.
so it's almost like the better you are, the less is important.
Hmm.
Um, and of course, like the for certain styles of photography too, like if you're shooting a lot of low light photography, you're shooting like skunks and stuff, or something like mammals that require.
Skunks is a very specific low light
Yeah, you know what?
subject to pick.
So yeah, so the reason I pulled up skunks was
Mhm.
because that was when skunks and foxes
Yeah.
or where I started getting really angry at my R5.
Hmm.
Like I just got like absolutely frustrated because the ISO ranges were high enough where I just couldn't produce the quality that I wanted.
Yeah.
And I had F4 lens too, and also had a F2 lens too. So I'm just
Hmm.
like I can't do if I can't do an F2, right? Like F2 is getting close, but like I need a camera that can produce better images in this kind of condition.
Yeah.
Like, there's like I was kind of screwed. So that's kind of why I was got the R3 initially.
Hmm.
And I've continued to just focus on the low megapixel cameras. I've got rid of my R5 at this point because I just never used it.
Yeah.
And I
You
had an
switched out for
R7. Yeah.
the R6 too, right?
Yeah. So yeah, that was a few weeks ago. I literally traded it. That sparked a lot of interesting conversations with people when I did
I
that.
wanted
Because
to ask about that if anybody got a
oh
little heated.
yeah. So people are very passionate about the R5 specifically. I
Hmm.
don't know what
Yeah.
it is about that camera. It's just like everyone's like, this is like the best camera ever. It's like, you know what? I've never liked it. I've honestly never
Yeah.
liked it
Yeah.
ever since the beginning. So I've always had like a problem with it, like just like little things that just irritate me.
Hmm.
And so I was like, yes, I got rid of it finally. And I announced it, and I'm like, okay, people are gonna get mad. And yeah, they did. I guys were like,
Yeah.
what? You got rid of the R5? How could you? It's the best camera ever. And like,
Yeah.
and I'll explain it to you, but I don't think you're gonna listen. Um, well, it's just like people they struggle to fathom other photographers who shoot differently than them,
Hmm.
right? Like I I mean I shoot with like such a wide variety of lenses. I'll shoot with like 28 millimeter lens, right? So like obviously with the lens like that, I'm getting close enough where I don't like I'm not cropping. Like
Yeah.
if I need to
Yeah.
crop, I'll just put the 40 on.
Hmm.
So like
Just casually pulls out another lens out of your pocket and just sticks it on the camera.
yeah, but I also realize that's kind of like so it's sort of like that's like me because like I have all these lenses. Like I also have an 800 millimeter lens I can put a teleconverter on. So
Yeah.
like like why like everything's in range, basically
Yeah.
that I would that's a reasonable situation. Everything's in range.
Hmm.
So like I understand like there's a certain like privilege to that where like a lot of other people are just don't have right. Like not everyone has like I have like I don't know 11 lenses right now,
Man,
11 or 12 lenses.
that's a
So
lot of
like,
lens.
not everyone has that.
Hmm.
Um, something I have to keep in mind when I'm talking to people. It's just a different situation.
Yeah. Yeah. When did the R5 come out? Was it like 2020 or somewhere?
2020. Yeah.
2020? Oh, that was a good guess. Is it it's an older camera. How does it hold up compared to like especially in like noise performance to like the Z9 and the Sony A1?
It's marginally better than the Z9
Hmm.
and it's a fair bit better than the A1.
Oh, really? So it's
Yeah.
better than both of those?
Yeah. So the reason why those are worse is because they have a stack sensor.
Hmm.
So the stack sensor, um, because of that extra readout, it's creating a lot more heat. Um, and just like other technical things going on there.
Yeah.
They tend to have worse dynamic range and slightly more noise.
Hmm.
Now, I will say the Z9, um, I've seen like people like I've seen specs online showing the noise performance. I've seen the charts and stuff. It performs better than what those make it out to. But the
Yeah.
A1 performs worse than how those. I don't know what. I think they have like this weird Sony bias or something because consistently it's like the A1 is like unquestionably noisier. Like not even like you can look at the full screen, it's just unquestionably noisier.
Yeah.
So because that stack sensor, it's just creating a little bit more noise, and the dynamic range, how much you can push and pull the highlights, is just a little bit worse. I mean, they're all kind of in the same ballpark.
Hmm.
Um, and like the R5 is probably they probably could have designed it to be cleaner if they made the readout speed on that camera slower as well.
Yeah.
Like on like the Sony A7 R5, that has a very slow readout on it.
Hmm.
But I think that the files, even though it has more megapixels, I think the files are probably overall, like globally, a little bit cleaner than even the R5,
Yeah.
despite having more megapixels than all of them. So it, there was like some technical things like that. So it's not just the age, like say like a Nikon D850 has
Hmm.
slightly better image quality than a Z9
Hmm.
in terms of dynamic range, just
Yeah.
because it doesn't have that stack sensor.
Hmm. That makes sense. Yeah, I got you. Yeah, it's interesting that because I was thinking for some reason I'd heard someone say that the R5 files were like noisy, like particularly noisy. But I haven't had experience with them, so I was under the impression that the R5 would have been worse than say like the A1 or the Z9. But is it is it like significantly better, or is it just? I mean, to the average person, would they not really notice?
So was it me who said it was really noisy? Because it might have been.
No, no, no. It was someone else. It was a different
Oh,
professional.
someone else.
Yeah, someone
Okay,
else.
because that sounds like something I would say. Um, no. The difference between the Z9 and the R5 is almost negligible.
Okay.
Like if I look at both files at 3200,
Hmm.
like maybe I can see it,
Yeah.
but not really. If you look at the A1, right, and I scale them to the same size, I can see a little bit more noise in the A1. It's
Yeah.
not like maybe like half a stop at most,
Hmm.
right? The A1 is sort of in like right in between, say, an R5 and R7 with the
Yeah.
way the noise is on it.
Hmm.
So it,
Oops, sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off and go.
oh no, it's okay. I had no actual thought.
All right, yeah. How is the R7's noise performance? Because I mean, that's the 32 on the crop sensor, right? I mean, I
Yeah,
imagine that's got to be a little difficult to deal with.
yeah. You know what? Like it depends on how you look at how you think about the noise.
Hmm.
So you can look at the noise at the pixel level, and in
Yeah.
that case, it's not good. It's pretty bad.
Yeah.
If you look at it from a global standpoint, right, and that's how you probably should look at it.
Yeah.
But if you look at it from a global standpoint, it's actually a very clean sensor. So if you cropped an R5 in to 1.6x that
Hmm.
to match the R7, full screen on both, and you compare them side by side. The R7's both cleaner and has more detail.
Oh, really?
But yeah, so it has a slower readout on the sensor, so it is like just an overall cleaner sensor
Yeah.
per area.
Hmm.
But in practice, people see that 32 megapixels and they're like, okay, I'm gonna crop into this, and it does it's like effectively cropping and super heavy, right? And the pixel density, so the size of the pixels and the amount that they're packed in, is
Hmm.
very similar to a micro four thirds camera. So the noise level is gonna be like a micro four thirds camera on the pixel level.
Yeah, I got you.
So it depends how you look at it. If you don't crop a lot, it's actually very good. It may be one of the best in that size range.
Hmm.
But if you're gonna compare that cropped into 20 megapixels against like a D500 cropped in the 20 megapixels, which is not cropped at all,
Hmm.
right? Then like for the same resolution, it's gonna be a lot messier.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. I feel like too, if you're gonna get a 32 crop sensor, I feel like cropping would be a pretty big priority, you know? Does that make sense? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. And that was so I had the R7 right for a while,
Hmm.
had it for 3 months, I think,
Yeah.
and it was a great camera, but it just was so poorly suited to the way I shoot because
Hmm.
like I'm not utilizing that extra those megapixels to crop, right?
Yeah.
And I'm shooting at ISO ranges that are higher than the camera really can handle.
Hmm.
So it just didn't mesh with me. But I have friends who have like 300 2.8s that use the R7, and it's wonderful for them because they're at 2.8. They can, they're never really pushing the ISO that high,
Yeah.
and it's like having, because on the it's 1.6x, so it's a 480 millimeter equivalent.
Hmm.
So it's kind of like having a 500 f4.
Okay, yeah, I got you.
Yeah, so it works really well for them. It's just it really depends on the style, and I think one of the issues with the R7 in particular is because it has that high megapixel count and it's APS-C. People who are less experienced shooters will buy it just to crop, and
Yeah.
I would say
Yeah.
on
That's what I was
average,
thinking.
yeah, because I'd say on average it probably produces, if you took like every bird photo taken with it, it
Mhm.
probably produces some of the worst results you can find,
Yeah. Yeah.
purely because of cropping.
Just because people are cropping too much. Yeah. No, that makes sense. I was thinking because I'm like, if you're gonna get, a crop sensor with 32 megapixels, I feel like someone buying that, one of their main priorities would be cropping in. And if you're doing that, it's just gonna kind of turn out, messy. Also looking at, with the Canon R series, how the R1, or maybe it'll be called something else, but I've heard a lot of rumors about this for over the past like 2 years, the next big Canon mirrorless camera. What roughly can we expect from that?
So I think we're going to expect something that's along the lines of an R3 body
Mhm.
with a 50 or maybe like a 45 to 61 megapixel stacked sensor.
Wow, yeah.
Um, and I expect Canon will, because they've already sort of done this with the R3. They've sort of found a solution for the reduced dynamic range.
Yeah.
I don't know what they did, but for some reason the R3 performs really well in that regard. So I think they'll probably translate that technology over into their one. So it's going to perform very well as a studio camera,
Mhm.
and it will have a lot of utility as a sports camera. I'm probably expecting it to shoot 30 frames per second at 61 megapixels, if I had to
That's crazy
guess.
still. Yeah.
Full raw, and I expect there also to be a faster frame rate available with a smaller raw file. So maybe
Mhm.
like a 20 megapixel raw file that can shoot like I don't know 100, I don't know, maybe 100 frames per second. I don't know, something crazy.
60 megapixels, yeah.
So I think that's we can kind of expect with that 8K video. Um, I mean, it's going to be a really interesting camera when it comes out, and
Mhm.
my gear acquisition syndrome is going to be like, oh, Alex, you should get that camera.
Yeah, I get
But
that.
then like
Yeah.
the logic is also just like, yeah, it's also going to be really expensive though.
Yeah. It might be worth it though. It sounds like it'll be a good camera. The Yeah, it's funny. I just love watching the different brands. Like I remember it was like Sony, the A1 came out and then that was on top. And then everyone's like, oh, Nikon's gonna die out. And then Nikon brings the Z9. And everyone's like, oh, Nikon's on top. And everyone goes buys a Z9. And then the R1's gonna come out. And then everyone's going, oh, Canon's on top. And it's just like a never ending cycle. It's just
Yeah,
gonna continue.
yeah. And also like who's on top, it depends on what your goals are, right? Like
Exactly.
if you're thinking of like just a pure high megapixel studio camera,
Mhm.
like this, like the Sony A7R5 is the best camera for that,
How many
right?
megapixels is that?
That's 61.
That's 60. Yeah, that's what I
Yeah,
was thinking. Yeah.
yeah. So like that would be the best for that. It also has the best dynamic range. on the
Mhm.
market. Um, if you're looking as a sports photographer, R3, that's, or like if you're doing low light wildlife, like that's the camera to have. If you're kind
Yeah.
of more of a general purpose wildlife photographer, cameras like the R5, Z9, Z8, and the A1 are going to be the most appealing for that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
it really depends.
I'm really waiting for them to just come out with like a Z6 III or something, because I really like my Z9, but I would like another, like a backup camera with a lower megapixel count. And one thing I do want to talk about with my Z9 is, do you think with new both in-body image stabilization and like AI noise reduction softwares, do you think the advantage provided by lower megapixel counts can kind of become obsolete eventually? Because I mean, I was shooting with my Z9 the other day and I did a 3 second exposure on a plover and it came out tack sharp. And I was able to shoot at like ISO 32, like 20 minutes after sundown. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, so I think for pure low light performance, like you're talking about like a still subject and stuff like that,
Mhm.
uh, there's not much advantage to the low megapixel cameras.
Yeah.
Where you see that advantage is for action. I
Yeah.
think things are moving. So like my splash series, for example, that was in blue hour, and
Mhm.
I had to. Well, actually, I don't think I actually cranked the ISO that high on that. And I think about it, but
Yeah.
um, I think I did some weird funny business with that.
Mhm.
Anyways, but hypothetically, if I push it to like, I potentially could have had to push that up to 12,800 or 25,600, right? The low megapixel camera will
25,000
just
ISO.
yep.
I could not do that. That's wild to me.
You
I
know what?
just, yeah.
On the R3, like it's not a problem. 25, like
Really?
yeah, like
Without denoising software, like
no,
straight
like
out of the phone?
you would need like a bit of denoising, but
A
actually,
bit. A bit.
you know what? Actually, 25. Let me think for a second. You know what? You could get away with not doing it
Are
for
you serious?
25,000. Yeah, for
On 20?
25,600. Yeah, it's if 51,000, then you definitely need it. But yeah,
Only
like
51,000?
only
Yeah.
51,000.
I feel like, I mean, I'm still kind of like, I've shot with the D500 for so long that
Yeah,
I really wouldn't push it over 2,500 ISO. And I don't use any denoising software. So even on my current camera, I try not to push it. I just shot my highest ISO I've ever shot the other night with a long tail duck at like 10,000,
mhm.
which was the highest. And it actually didn't look terrible, which I was surprised by. But yeah, 25,000. I can't even.
Yeah. I've shot my R5 up to 25,600 before,
Holy shit.
um, and it was not pretty. But
I can
if
imagine.
you if you can if you know your denoising software, you
Mhm.
could make it like kind of work. Depends on the
Yeah.
application. Like for print, forget it. It's not good.
Yeah.
Even uncropped. Whereas like the R3, like oh yeah, I'll print that. Like even it's just like a little bit of noise. You know what it is? It's not the noise itself that kills it. It's the
Mhm.
loss of color and rendering that's
Yeah.
gonna kill you. It's like the contrast disappears, like the way the details look, just the depth of field looks all muddy.
Mhm.
Like that's what's gonna kill the image, and that's where denoising software can't really help you because all it does is just smooths that out. It's not actually
Mhm.
going to it's not going to like re-render the image, not yet at least.
Not yet. Yeah. Imagine just like 5 years down the line. Yeah, that makes sense. I get what you're saying. I just I don't use denoising software and I need to start using it. I'm really bad with computers, which is a fun thing about me. I'm really terrible at technology, generally speaking. So trying to set up like a denoising software thing is really, I end up just pushing it off to tomorrow, and I've been doing that for like a year now. you know
That sounds
so
like a lot of my business stuff.
yep,
Push it off.
yep, just going on to the next thing. That's, well, with my Z9, I didn't shoot animal eye out of focus until like 2 weeks ago, and I've had it for 5 or 6 months because I just I just was like, I tried the first day I got it to set up animal eye on back button and spot focus on shutter. Couldn't figure it out and go, I'll do it tomorrow. I went to bed, and then this one kid I was shooting with in the field, he was a kid from Ohio, and I was shooting at my indigo bunting spot with him, and he had rented the Z9, and he got really mad that I hadn't put eye autofocus on. So he just like grabbed my camera and turned it on, and they gave it back to me.
Oh, but yeah, I remember when you told me.
Mm-hmm.
I remember when you told me that, and like I was like, I don't know, it's like I think Jack messaged me. He's like, "What the f? Like,
Yeah.
what is wrong with him?" And it was like, I'm like, dude, I'm offended too, but like I understand. Yeah, so I have clients that have I've worked with for like years, like literally years. Yeah, yeah. So I've been working with them for literally years, and they've been shooting like R5s, R6s.
Mhm.
Never have used the eye autofocus, like not
Jeez,
even once.
that's
And I was like,
crazy.
that's kind of the point.
Yeah.
And I'll tell them to use it, and I'm like, no, it's too complicated.
Mhm.
I'm like okay,
That's like,
enjoy.
yeah. I mean, I guess the thing for me was I went from V500 on a Sigma. So just the spot focus with the in-body image stabilization and the electronic viewfinder was already so like earth-shattering that I never took the steps to improve it further. So I'm probably going to have to go in and kind of mess around and set up some more stuff on my camera because it's about time I've done that. Now, looking also a little bit more on lenses, I do want to touch on some stuff really quickly about shorter focal lengths and shooting like wide angles and stuff like that. Because I feel like everyone immediately wants to get like the new 800 millimeter PF or whatever from Nikon or the new highest focal length, and they just want close, close, close. But there's a not so insignificant cohort of people now, especially like on the online community, who really enjoy shorter focal length images with wildlife, wide angle environmental images, and not necessarily like a landscape, but like an animal that's actually close to the camera, but wide angle. So can you talk about like some of the advantages of using shorter focal lengths or even like mid-range focal lengths for wildlife photography? Because I feel like that's really overlooked pretty often.
Oh yeah, like well, I think the thing with wildlife photography that happens is your perspective of what's considered long and
Mhm.
short just gets all screwed up, right?
Yeah.
Like a long lens for a portrait photographer is like 135 millimeter, right?
Yeah.
That's a long lens, and then
Mhm.
like a really long lens is like a 200 or 300. Whereas
Mhm.
for wildlife photographers, like 300 or even 400 is like a short lens,
Yeah.
and I'm kind of like I'm always surprised that because 400 millimeters is probably my most used focal length,
Mhm.
and like I remember someone did a video talking about short lenses, and their arbitrary cutoff was like 450 millimeters. I was like, really? That's a
Oddly
that's
specific too.
it's because on a Nikon DSLR that has a crop sensor has a
Mhm.
300 millimeter lens. So that was where the cutoff was.
Yeah. Yeah.
So like because I guess as someone who starts off to the 7300 and then uses it that way, I think that was the logic behind it.
Mhm.
But um, but like yeah, these shorter lenses they are almost forgotten, like a forgotten secret.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like I think like what you'll see like someone shooting a 600, 800, maybe a 500, and then they'll like own a 2470 or something, but then they'll
Mhm.
like never really use it.
Just like collects dust on the shelf.
Yeah, just collecting dust. And I know a few people like that.
Mhm.
Um, but like my mindset with using short lenses has always been if I have it, I should try to use it because like I have all these lenses for portrait photography. It's like why not try to make a wildlife image with a 28 1.4
Mhm.
or 40 1.4, and you start to realize there's a lot of advantages to using them, right? So to start, you have wider apertures. If so like a regular zoom, like a pretty standard zoom, right, would be 2470 2.8.
Yeah.
That's a 2.8. That's better than most longer lenses. Like I mean, obviously there's like like 200 f2, which
Mhm.
I guess that's also a short lens though, right?
Yeah.
Um, and like a 400 2.8, and yeah, but that's like a super expensive lens.
Mhm.
So getting like the default being 2.8, and then you're going up from there, right? That's pretty cool. You can shoot in much lower light situations. You can shoot animals that are moving more. You can um you get this certain depth of field fall off that's just a little bit different looking.
Yeah.
I know some people have mentioned it when I shoot with my 135 1.8. It
Mhm.
just like has this much faster fall off. You just can't get it. I had a 400 2.8 before. It's not even close in that regard.
Yeah.
It just doesn't compare. Right.
Mhm.
You also can get more context in the scene while also retaining the animal at a larger size if you're going to do a large frame.
Mhm.
Or if you're doing a small frame, you get things more into proper scale, right? Because one of the issues with the telephoto, and it's like an artistic thing, right? It can be an artistic thing, is they have a lot of compression, so things look a little bit out of scale relative to reality.
Yeah.
Whereas with a standard lens, like a wider lens, like a 50 millimeter 2470,
Mhm.
things are going to look much more proportionate. So a lot of the proportions of the birds themselves are going to be, you know, more in line with reality.
Yeah.
and it's going to be matched you're going to feel like you're more connected to the subjects because you're just physically closer,
Hmm.
and so you have this much shorter perspective. The other thing is, I think it makes you a better photographer using these short lenses, because you have to think about things differently. You can't rely on the same compositional techniques.
Yeah.
So like when you're shooting say like my 800 millimeter lens, like if I want, like I can just eat every background, like just every background
Yeah.
gone.
Yeah.
But that can lead to very basic images, right?
Hmm.
Like bird, no
On a
background.
stick with the
Yeah,
back.
but just the classic bird on stick photo.
Hmm.
Wide angle, you're not doing that. Like
Yeah.
it's not even possible.
Hmm.
So you have to incorporate the environment in a different way, and it's really it's the way my mind has been working. It's really allowed me to kind of create these almost like environments that just aren't what you normally see, right? With like say the volcanic series or rapids, any of these like these different series that I've been working on. And that's all from like kind of my mindset of incorporating all those environmental elements from doing that wider angle shooting.
Hmm.
And I think there's also just I think you just get to know your subjects better. You're forced into knowing your subjects better when
Hmm.
you're shooting wider. You have to get physically closer. In many cases, a lot physically closer.
Especially like a
And
28 or something, right?
yeah, the 28, or if I really want to try the 14 or the 11 millimeter fisheye on
Oh
like a
yeah.
little
Yeah.
bird, but
Yeah.
I don't know.
Got to be like 2 inches away.
We'll see. I don't actually know if they're capable of focusing that close. Um, but you are forced to learn the behavior of the subject, and you're forced to respect them a bit more, because if you don't, you're screwed. You can't.
Hmm.
It's just not possible.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one question I had, like how to approach, because like if I'm shooting like 500, or if you're shooting 600 or 800 or something like that, you can really keep your distance from the subject and get good shots of it pretty easily, relatively easily, compared to if you want to get like a wide angle on 28, or if you want to shoot with like a 14 or whatever. How is it, just you have to just research the subject and learn its behavior to approach it ethically, or is it is that something that's more reserved to habituated birds, or do you really kind of, because I know sometimes people will resort to some other tactics like playback or something like that, and a remote camera, you know what I'm saying? So how do you usually shoot habituated animals when you do that?
It depends.
Mhm.
Um, part of it depends on exactly how short we're talking.
Yeah.
With like a 200 millimeter lens, you could, if you can shoot a large in frame at 400 or 600, you
Mhm.
can shoot a medium in frame with a 200,
With a
right?
200, yeah, 200 is
Yeah,
not that bad, yeah.
the 200 is like very very usable.
Mhm.
135 a little bit less so, but I mean, I don't I'll just shoot I'll shoot wild animals with like completely wild animals with a 135. It just requires you to have a little bit more patience with the approach.
Mhm.
Once you start getting to the 85 and under, it's very very situational. There are animals that are just inherently not as afraid of you,
Yeah.
and or they're bigger, so they're easier to get close to, in terms of like with the framing.
Mhm.
um so for those, yeah, for those, you can use like say an 85 or a maybe a 50. But if you're trying to do like a shoot a really ultra wide angle,
Mhm.
um even on a habituated animal, it is sometimes just it's just not
Oh,
going to happen, right?
yeah.
um with the red knot, it wasn't really habituated in the same way, like the one like the red knot that I photographed.
Yeah.
um I was just very very lucky. It was like just constantly ignoring me. So
Yeah.
there is just an element of luck. Like I keep it in the bag, knowing that I'm like 99% of the time not going to use it,
Mhm.
and that's like just that's something you got to keep in mind when you're shooting these short focal lengths. It's something that you're not going to go out and say, oh, okay, I'm going to shoot a bird with a 28 millimeter.
Yeah.
Like, no, that's just
Not gonna happen.
even if
Yeah.
you have habituated birds, even if you're trying to like for example, like just to give you the working distance of the 28, if I'm trying to shoot a chickadee, with 28, I could have the lens on my hand and the bird on my hand. It'll still be medium in
Too
frame.
far away.
Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah. So like for that kind of stuff, you just you gotta be realistic. And I know that some people, to force those situations, will use feeding or playback and remote cameras. Um, Remote cameras, that's a good way to do wide angle in a more a less intrusive way for more skittish animals.
Yeah.
The problem with that is, in general, you won't have as much control over your depth of field. So
Mhm.
you're like shooting a 1.4 lens for that is going to be tricky. Um, unless you know have a way to get the animal specifically into this exact spot, and that's where things like playback come in. So if you're shooting like a want to shoot a warbler, um, you could set up the perch, and then have the thing there and focus on it, call them in, click the photo that way. That's a very it's a kind of controversial
Very
approach to do it.
controversial. Yeah. I'm gonna have to
Um,
do a full episode on playback at some point
yeah,
because
that's not something I do. For
yeah,
me, I'm like in the
same,
field.
yeah.
I'm physically holding the camera, and
Mhm.
just I realize that's like the hard way, but it's more rewarding to me to do it that way, and also
Yeah.
gives me that capability to control the composition in the moment, so I can get more different kinds of shots.
Mhm.
Um, what I tend to do is I tend to position myself in a way where I'm not very intrusive, and then I just wait. So I have an idea of the composition in my mind, and I know that, say like with the red dot, I knew that it would make its way along the shoreline,
Mhm.
and it would. I knew based on past experience that it would walk towards me. I didn't know if it was going to come within 28 millimeter range,
Yeah.
but I thought, you know what? I shot it with the 135 and the 200 to 400 already all day,
Mhm.
or all session. Why not just pull the 28 out and just
Just
try to
give it a
create
shot.
something really cool? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's what I did, and it worked out for 2 days.
That's
I
great.
had
Yeah.
2 days where I did. Yeah, so it was pretty wild.
Yeah, I've been thinking about I had this idea last year. My main shorebird spot has a pretty good amount of piping plovers on a small beach. And what I've been thinking about, what I tried last year, and this was on the D500, so it was very difficult. I wasn't able to make it work, but I was sitting there with a tripod shooting down, slow shutter speed, and I was trying to get a plover with a long exposure wave coming in with a standing still plover. And it didn't really work. But also the issue I had too, and this was on like 40 millimeters or something like that, was I was just kind of like in normal clothes. So what I'm thinking about doing this year is coming back in a ghillie suit and lying down and waiting for them to come down my way. But the issue is I'm just gonna look so goofy doing that. Like there's like normal people at this beach, and it's gonna be really concerning to just see someone walking around in a big green grass suit and lying down right on the water. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I know exactly what you're saying. I've I've been in that situation where people just looking at you. I like,
Yeah.
well, like at my spot, I was shooting from the water for a few
Uh-huh.
of the days,
Yeah.
and sometimes it'll be a regular person walking by, like, what the hell is this guy doing? And
Mhm.
I'll like, I mean, I'm sure there's a lot of photos of me just in private group chats, like, what the hell is this is a
This
weirdo.
person's just
Yeah,
in the
this,
water. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, um, and even other photographers will look at you and they're just like, this guy's
Well,
insane.
that's just a badge of honor, though. If the other
Yeah,
wildlife photographers are looking at you like that,
yeah,
you're doing something right.
yeah. You know what? Last year was worse though. There was all this shorebird muck, the shorebird grease
Yeah. Yeah.
along the beach.
Yeah.
It was like a maybe I don't know, like a foot deep, and I just
Jeez.
army crawled through it. And everyone else was like, I would say there's maybe like 30 photographers all
Yeah.
taking pictures of me
Mhm.
because they were hoping that the birds would land on me and walk over
Yeah.
me. And I think a few of them did, which
Uh-huh.
is pretty cool. Um, but yeah, like, if you're gonna shoot wide angle, you gotta be committed. I was shooting the 85 millimeter that day,
Mhm.
and like I got a few shots, but if I was shooting the 28, like I'm getting like I don't know, I'd be tempted to go deeper in and just like hold the camera up above me while in the water.
Yeah. 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 That would be. I that sketches me out. Like being in water. When I was in Alaska, I was shooting some horned grebes with some people, and I was with a couple of people. We were trying to move along like a bank of grass, and the water just got. I mean, the bottom got muddy, and I had to bail out because at the time that was my only camera, and this was before I started working, so I didn't have any money. So if I dropped it, I was kind of screwed, right? So I had to bail out because my feet kept getting stuck in the mud and everything. Yeah, but also when you're shooting with shorter focal lengths, and then I think I'm going to ask this question and then have one more question because I just looked at our stopwatch. It felt like 10 minutes, but we are
Yeah.
we are. This is
I
gonna
know,
be
right?
probably
I know.
my longest episode. When you're shooting with shorter focal lengths, have you noticed people like judging you
Oh
about
yeah.
like,
Oh yeah.
having a short lens? Yeah.
Yeah. So one of the things I like to do, just I don't know, I find it funny when people judge me.
Hmm.
Is I'll have the 800 millimeter in my bag,
Yeah.
and then I'll walk around like like a 28, or maybe sometimes I'll honestly walk around without even a lens on. I'll just have like the adapter,
Yeah. Yeah.
just just so people like what the heck is this guy doing? I'm full camouflage. Oh, sorry, I'm
It's
full camouflage. I'm full camouflage, and I'm just walking around with like nothing lens, and people are
Mhm.
like, and there are people showing up there with like your typical like 200 to 600 f4 type lenses, bigger chunkier lenses,
Yeah.
and they're like, this guy is a freaking idiot. And then especially if I do start doing something really silly, I'll put the little lens on, I'll like get into the shorebird grease and start army crawling through it,
Yeah.
or I'll get into the water, or I'll just like hold my camera just way in front of me and like shoot at the back screen.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like they'll just like the face of disgust is incredible. It's so satisfying to see.
Hmm.
um they're just like, oh my god, this guy is disgusting. He's like not, he's getting
Peasant
all these
with a
horrible
28 millimeter.
yeah,
Yeah.
peasant. But like there's so much judgment around gear.
Yeah.
It's remarkable. Like, and like occasionally what I'll do is when they're looking, I'll switch to the 800 and I'll just whip it out, and it's just like, and they're like, oh.
This guy's actually
Oh.
serious. Yeah.
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 um but like I know, like I've heard people in the field just talk crap, like to like if I have my 800 out and I'm holding it in my hand, the guy next to me will just talk crap about like a little girl shooting with like a 70 to 300. I'm like, you don't know what she's making. You don't know what she's making with that lens. She can be making like the most incredible award-winning image. It's not the lens, it's the photographer.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, that's one thing I'm glad that I've shot with D500 and, Sigma for a very long time, because I feel like I was able to produce some pretty good work with that, moderately lower end setup. So now that I have, like, when I see people out in the field and I see someone with a Z9 and a 402.8 with a built-in teleconverter, my first thought isn't like, oh, their photos must be really good. My first thought is like, oh, they're a photographer. Honestly, and maybe this isn't the best thing, but when I see someone out there with like a crazy flagship, $20,000 setup, my initial thought is to think their photos are probably worse than average. you know,
Yeah, same here.
because I see it and I'm like, this person, and this is not a good, because I mean, I realize I'm going out there with a pretty high end setup now, and I wouldn't want someone to think this about me, but like my brain just intuitively goes, oh, they probably rely heavily on their gear. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, I sometimes I'll like think about myself walking around with that 800 millimeter lens and the
Mhm.
R3 and think, yeah, this is I look like a fucking, oh, sorry. I
That's
don't
okay. You can, I don't care. You're
I
doing
look,
so good.
I was down real good. Yeah. It's like, oh, oh crap. I look like one of those tripod crew guys that just walking
Yeah.
around like
Yeah.
shooting downwards. And like sometimes I will set the tripod high, and it's not to shoot downwards, it's to shoot like very very specific techniques. And
Mhm.
but I'm like, oh god, I look like one of those people. Like
Yeah.
I look like someone who doesn't know what the hell they're doing with really expensive gear,
Hmm.
and have to live with that.
Yep. Well, at least you can know that you know what you're doing, in your own head.
Yep.
Yeah, but that's something, I mean, I feel like there's a lot of self-consciousness around gear, and it's like the gear does not matter as much as a lot of people will make it out to. I mean, it definitely matters. And that's one thing I've noticed is if you have if you really refine your skills on like a lower end setup and you jump to a higher end setup, the advantages are insane. Like, especially like mirrorless, the electronic viewfinder is ridiculous. The in-body image stabilization is ridiculous. But at the same time, if you gave me my old setup back and you said you have to shoot this for a year, I'd live, because like,
Oh yeah.
I know some people are like, oh, I feel so terrible about my gear. I feel like, I can't take it. I'm like, dude, some of the better photographers I know take like Tobias, for example, he's like I think he shot once with like a lens that was like taped to his camera or something. It's like, it's just really just is the photographer and not necessarily the
Oh
gear.
yeah. Oh yeah. 100%. Yeah. I mean, like I have all this high end gear, but I don't think I really need it. To be
Mhm.
honest, I really enjoyed shooting with the little Canon R10 and the 100 to 400 when I had that. It was like that was great.
Yeah.
I didn't feel like I was being hindered. In fact, in some ways, maybe I was getting better shots because I just was forced to think more about the composition and just not use the pure horsepower.
Hmm.
And I'm like now I'm shooting with a 28 millimeter or 40 millimeter 135. Right, these are lenses that are like they're kind of exotic because they're 1.4 lenses, but if they were like a cheaper 1.8 version, I'd still be producing the very similar images. That wouldn't make a difference. And
Yeah.
I think people, like the gear, it like matters, but not really, right? It's
Hmm.
you can make, and I've said this before, like you can make incredible images with basically anything. It's just a matter of what kind of images that you're trying to go for, and some things are gonna be better than others for that.
Yeah. Yeah, I got you. Man, that went so fast. I think one last question I kind of want to ask is for anyone who's either looking to, if anyone's listening to this who isn't really a wildlife photographer, is looking to get gear, or someone who's looking to change over gear, or, as you said, move from that kind of middle cohort of people that just kind of takes images and is looking to get out of that and become more specialized. What are like 3 steps that you would advise someone take to kind of maximize their gear purchase and make sure they kind of do it correctly?
Ooh, that is a very tough question.
Oh boy. Sorry.
Um, I mean, push comes to shove, you can just message me.
Okay, bet, yeah. Just
I
set up
mean,
some
like I
consultation.
will yeah. I mean, if it's an easy question to answer, I will just tell you. I won't. We don't have to do a consultation or anything.
Yeah, yeah.
If you have much more complicated things, we can set up a consultation.
Hmm.
It's kind of in the middle. Like usually, I'm not going to push people into a consultation. I'll discuss it and lay things out, but I'm not going to go like super in depth.
Yeah.
Um, but if you want to do it yourself, um, it's challenging because you're going to want it. You're going to get a lot of different perspectives on things,
Yeah.
right? Like some people are going to give you one piece of advice, other people are going to give you a different piece of advice. Like I know in general, like my clients have been given less optimal advice in the past.
Yeah.
So, um, yeah, that's. I don't know if I have a like a 3 step piece of advice there. It's actually hard.
I got you. Yeah.
Yeah,
It's just so complicated that.
yeah. It could be because it is just it's so personal a lot of
Mhm.
times.
Yeah. So basically, step one is just message you, and step
Yeah.
two, set up a consultation, and some free advertising.
Step three, buy the gear. Yeah.
Yep, yep. Yeah, man. Well, hey, if anyone's listening and they want gear consultation, they know who to go to now, right?
Yep. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, of course.
So for anyone who wants to find you online, like on Instagram, or if do you have a website right now?
It's complicated. It's by the time this is released, I may have one
Oh,
or
really?
may not. It is, yeah, it is
You may or you
under
may not. Yeah.
it is under constant development. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Because the business model keeps changing and I keep like almost finishing like, oh crap, now it's different.
Mhm.
So it's close to being re-released,
Yeah.
but I think for now it's best to just contact me through Instagram.
Mhm. And what's your
So
tag on Instagram?
it's at Alex underscore Prieditis at ALEX underscore PRIEDITIS.
Sweet. And for your website, are you using Squarespace, or what are you using?
I'm using
I,
Squarespace.
I use Squarespace for mine. It's really sleek. I really like it a lot.
Yeah, yeah, it's great. It's funny though, like it's like the website's been the constant cycle of being pulled and not pulled, pulled and released.
Yeah.
Like at this point, I'm just like, is this ever gonna be announced? And I'm starting to become an actual problem that I don't have it out. Because
Yeah.
now people are like, oh, Alex, can I book something? I don't have Instagram. Like, I'm like, just I'm like, text me, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I mean, what I did is honestly, I spent about 3 months building mine, like constant, like late nights, just working on it. I put it up and now I just edit it from there.
Yeah,
I haven't pulled it down or anything.
that's a good idea.
It's so I just kind of work on it like a construction um project as it goes along, but that was a really good episode. That was really insightful. I'm gonna have to do more gear episodes later in the future though, because I'd like to do like low light specific episodes. I'd like to do
for sure,
like action and things like that. But yeah, that was a lot of fun. That was more fun than I thought it was gonna be, talking about gear and stuff like that.
I know. It's funny. Like, I was like talking about gear for an hour on a podcast. It's like, I can definitely do it, but will it be boring?
yeah. I was worried. I'm like, I didn't want to like. I was worried that people are gonna sit here and it was gonna be like, oh well, the 302.8 is blah blah blah. Like, I didn't want to bore people, but I think it went really well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do like a full consultation. It's like, yeah, it's like, well, you could buy the 302.8 Mark 1, the Mark 2, or the 100 to 300. You could buy the 400 4. It's like, I'll lay these out. You got the 2.5 meter minimum focus distance, the 2 meter focus distance, and the 2 meter focus distance there, and also the 3.5. Now, the focus breathing is very different on those different lenses.
Just for
the 100 to 300 has a little bit of focus breathing, and then yeah. So the money aspect, you could buy this. Yeah, that would be. Oh, I won't even listen to myself do that. That's a thing. Like,
you should make like an animation chart with like a bunch of bubbles and like lines and everything. Just like 2 hours straight of all lenses you can buy.
Just me. Yeah. I released the website and then I just have that as the only like thing on there.
Only page. Just the homepage with the bio, and then the second page is just that.
Yeah, the bio just saying, I like shorebirds and gear. That's it.
Yeah. Man, well, that was a lot of fun. Thank you for coming on.
Oh yeah, this was great. I love this. I was looking forward to doing this for a while. I'm like, oh yeah, I can talk about gear on a podcast. Because on my own podcast, like, yeah, I'll talk about gear, but I don't think I'm gonna do like a full gear episode.
I don't know if you mentioned that you're gonna make a podcast, did you?
Oh yeah, no, I didn't know. Yeah.
Well, now you guys know he's gonna make a podcast.
Yeah. Yeah. Wildlife photography unhinged.
Yeah, is that the title? Is that what's called?
That is the title.
Bet I'll announce it on this page when you put it up.
Oh yeah, it's gonna be interesting. First episode is gonna be on echo chambers, and then it's gonna go into like photographer archetypes. And I don't know, it's designed to be like entertainment more than education. Like, there will be like education in it, but I just wanted to create something that was just dumb, like something that's really like dumb, silly, really silly. I think like, I don't know, like I feel like there's a hole in the wildlife photography podcast for just like something that's just really silly. Like, just like I don't know, I want, like, honestly, I want to bring on like someone who baits owls, and just grill them. Like,
see how long they'll stay on the call before they
or even better, agree with them until the point where it's like, yeah, I'll just effing with you. I was like, and then grilling them.
Man, yeah. Well, maybe I'll have to get you on for a second podcast down the line. Maybe gear or ethics or something. Yeah,
that'd be interesting. Yeah, gear, ethics. Yeah, there is. I mean, this podcast could have been like 3 hours, right?
Yeah.
Like the ethics in using gear. That's something we talked about that briefly with the short focal lengths, but that's something that we don't. Like, you hear people talk about, like, oh, you need to always shoot with an 800 millimeter lens, or like I know, like, Melissa Grew has been advocating for like 600, 800 all the time, and it's like, well, not really though. You don't, like, I mean, I understand. I definitely understand the logic behind telling people that, because you don't want people to keep flushing the birds, right?
Yeah,
but at the same time, like, just because you have a longer lens doesn't mean you're being more ethical than someone with a short lens. If you to use a short lens successfully, you have to be very, very respectful and stealthy
and in touch with your subject.
And very in touch with the subject, exactly. So you to use a 20, you really, like, unless you're like capturing the bird or something, it's very hard to be successful and be unethical unless you're doing something like baiting or playback.
Yeah, I got you. Yeah. Well, yeah, we could do that. We could do like a general ethics discussion, another like gear specific. I mean, we could just like, there's so many topics. This one could have gone on forever, but yeah. So thank you for coming on though. That was a lot of fun.
Yeah, that was great.